Hey ladies, how's it going? It's hardcore's hardest working man here, Dan Frampton, and today we're going to do one of those Iceberg videos. Now they're going around the internet for a couple years now, and basically, if you're unfamiliar with the format, it's like this picture of an iceberg, and on the top of the iceberg is the most familiar stuff of a topic, and the farther you go down, you get the more obscure cuts. Now with these iceberg videos, you know, they range from everything from TV shows to books to movies, you name it, there's an iceberg for it. However, this particular iceberg does not exist on YouTube yet, so I thought that I would do it. Now typically icebergs are like a really research heavy video format to do, and I felt like, well, not really doing all that research right off the bat. So this video is going to be basically me going through this iceberg right here about all these punk rock bands and doing a little bit of research alongside you guys. Now a lot of these selections I agree with, but there are some I disagree with. I think some of the placements on this could be a little bit different, and it's mostly like old school punk rock bands, and I think we can do a more modern version one day, but in order to just knock this out of the bag, let's do it right now. Of course, they start right off the top in the heaven tier with the Sex Pistols. Now it says here the Sex Pistols were an English punk rock band formed in 1975, and yeah, that they were, in like this I don't know, boutique shop called Sex. And this is Sex Pistols. Everybody knows the Sex Pistols story. There's a reason why they're the very first band on this iceberg list or whatever. So yeah, I agree with the placement of this band at the very, very top. The next band we got here is The Clash. And would you look at that? They're also an English punk rock band, but they're formed in 1976, and I would have to say that The Clash do belong in the number 2 spot because everybody knows The Clash, and their first record, just like the Sex Pistols' first record, is just a meat and potatoes punk rock record. I'd even say it's closer to proto-punk before things really got rolling with the genre. And then when punk rock really got rolling, The Clash got really experimental, so I don't know exactly how punk rock they stayed, but they do belong in the number 2 spot there. Okay, right along the Sex Pistols and The Clash, we got Green Day. And I'd have to say that Green Day are kind of the 90s version of the Sex Pistols. Very basic, very huge, and they do belong right there at the very, very top of this iceberg. But if you're unfamiliar, Green Day is an American rock band formed in the East Bay in 1987. So about 10 years after those other two bands got rolling. And everybody knows Green Day, but I'd have to say my favorite record of theirs is Nimrod, just because that's the one that I kind of grew up on. That's the one that has the most nostalgic feels for me. But let's move down on this iceberg to Blink-182. Now I think Green Day or Blink-182 are relatively interchangeable here on this iceberg list. But you know, the classic lineup of Mark, Tom, and Travis, and even before Travis, there's this guy called Scott playing the drums. Great band, very influential, especially to me as like an adolescent teenager or whatever. These guys meant a lot to me. I loved their poop and fart jokes. Everything about them when I was 13 was everything that I loved about music. Now this next selection is a bit of a head scratcher. It's Fugazi. They're a little bit later on in the 80s, and I don't know if I'd put them this high up on the iceberg, like all the way up here in the heaven tier. I'm not sure if I agree with that, but if you're not familiar with Fugazi, they were like that band by Ian MacKaye, who used to be in a band called Minor Threat, who I'm sure we'll see on this iceberg, but I'd interchange those bands because more people are familiar with like Minor Threat and how iconic they are. Well, at least in the circles that I have run in through my life or whatever. And yeah, Fugazi are huge and they have that huge song Waiting Room, but I don't think anything that they did even comes close to what Minor Threat did earlier on. Now this next one is a head scratcher, but for a different reason. This is the Stooges, and I wouldn't consider Iggy Pop and the Stooges to be a punk rock band. I would consider them to be the grandfathers of punk rock, maybe proto-punk or whatever, but you know, if you're gonna consider them punk rock, they do belong up here with these names of the most iconic in the genre. But if you're not familiar, the Stooges were originally billed as the Psychedelic Stooges and were fronted by the maniac Iggy Pop, who the records say he was the first person to stage dive, even though I disagree with that. Because I think the first stage dive would have been an accident. Now this next band I'd replace with The Clash. I'd have them up here at number 2, maybe even the number 1 slot, and that is the Ramones. I believe the Ramones to be the ones that really laid down the foundation of pop punk, punk rock that would be like picked apart and used to create all sorts of other kinds of music in the genre. Like they were basically a surf rock band that just played super fast. So they formed before punk rock and they helped create punk rock. I think that these guys are the very top, the very tippity top of the iceberg. All right, now just below that, on this little town, on this cloud or whatever, we got the Dead Kennedys. You know that band fronted by Jello Biafra? I think that that's a good spot for them. But if you don't know about them, they're a very like political band. They like to like go on speeches and try to convince you of things, and go on TV shows and try to convince TV shows of things. And they have a whole lot of really like historic moments attributed to their name, and a really iconic logo that is kind of like one of the best the genre has ever seen. So as long as we're talking about punk rock through all the annals of time, we will be talking about Dead Kennedys. And Jello Biafra is still going today, still yammering on. All right, this next band, I don't know if I'd really ever call them a punk band. Maybe like proto-indie, but you know, they are considered punk rock in like the whole bigger picture or whatever. And who am I to argue, but it's Husker Du. They were formed in 1979 in Minnesota, and I never really got too much into Husker Du. I thought they were like kind of a fun band that put out some like pretty boppy jams, but you know, they weren't really 100% my thing. But do I think that they belong here, up here in like the heaven tier? I'm not sure about that. I might have them like maybe just even a bit below the surface, if I'm being honest with you. But yeah, the Misfits over here, they do belong up here in heaven tier. You know, the Misfits, that lunchbox company that had Glenn Danzig scream for them for a bit, and have like Jerry Only being big and muscular and have the devil locks. You know, those guys, the Misfits. Very iconic band. And again, they're gonna be one of these bands that persist through time. Like when our civilization is dead and gone and we're digging up remnants, there's gonna be so many of these misfit skulls that like future aliens are gonna find. All right, let's bump down a tier here and let's go to Bad Religion. Everybody knows Bad Religion. They're kind of those guys that were the beginnings of skate punk. You know, they kind of were the forefathers of kind of pop punk, kind of punk rock, but really fast in the 80s in Los Angeles. And you know, they'd go on to start that record label Epitaph, and they're still going today. Very influential. I'd even have them a little bit higher on the list if I'm being honest with you. I might put Bad Religion up here where the Stooges are. And it's just so funny to think that on this iceberg list, the Bad Religion is considered one of the newer bands. Now, if I'm being honest with you, Black Flag is our next selection, and where Fugazi currently sits, this is where I would have Minor Threat and Black Flag kind of sitting together. But Black Flag, you know, very iconic band. Keith Morris was the first singer, then Ron Reese came in after that, and then my favorite, Henry Rollins, came in to like, I don't know, do slam poetry to hardcore music. I don't know, man. Black Flag is kind of a cool band, but they were never really my thing. But I can't deny that their records are great, that their songs are amazing, that they're really super influential to everything that came out, especially in the hardcore side of the world. So Black Flag, they were formed in 1976 in Hermosa Beach, California. Okay, let's go down another level here, and I'm gonna introduce you guys to The Wire. I guess just Wire, not the television show The Wire, which I loved. This band, Wire, I'm actually not super familiar with, to tell you the truth. 1976, another English band. Now, I kind of like English music, you know, I like those English punk rock bands, but I gotta be upfront with you, never really delved too much into The Wire discography. And because of that fact alone, I would bump them down to a little bit below the surface here. But let's talk about the next band, The Damned. Now, The Damned are a classic band, and yeah, maybe I'd put them right about where they are here. That's a pretty good spot for them. But if you want to talk about English bands that are kind of proto-punk, that kind of helped kickstart that whole punk rock movement, goddamn, The Damned is one of those bands. They helped set the tone, the style, like the sound, everything that would become punk rock. And now, if you're going to be talking about the origins of punk rock, you would be remiss to leave out The Damned. They are about as influential as it gets, but yeah, they do belong right where they are here on this list. Now, next we get Minor Threat, which I've already said should be a little bit higher here on this list. But Ian MacKaye basically kicking off an entire straight edge movement with this band that is still around to this day. Now when they put out that song, Straight Edge, there was not really a whole straight edge community or straight edge movement. They were just, creating a thing. We don't do drugs, it's called straight edge. Look at these X's on our hands. No drugs, no drinking, straight edge. And then by the time they broke up, their message spread across the whole country, and then straight edge became a thing. And they couldn't really revel in that because they've already started other bands. So because of how influential they are, because of how good they are, because of how their music still resonates to this day, I would put them way higher on this list. All that I just said about Minor Threat, I could say about Bad Brains. God damn, what a band. These guys could play the shit out of their instruments. These guys might have been the best musicians in the entire scene back then. Now they were in DC, formed in 1976, before the whole punk rock thing, and they were doing reggae and ska and that sort of thing. But then when they heard, oh my god, hardcore is kind of kicking off, they started playing hardcore, and they started playing it better than everybody around them in an area where hardcore was kind of happening, And wouldn't that have been so sick to be around the DC area with Bad Brains and Minor Threat at the genesis of their creation? Holy smokes, that's a time and place. Okay, this next band, The Jam, is another band that I gotta be honest, I haven't really heard of before this list, so I might put them a little bit below the surface here, but they were formed in 1972, it looks like, which puts them solidly in proto-punk territory. But yeah, look at them here with the graffiti and the style of them. That's very proto-punk, very British kind of rock and roll. Okay, let's move down to the band over here called Buzzcocks. I might even put them a little bit higher on the list. They're one of those British bands that formed right around the time that punk rock was happening, really helped kick it into overdrive, and you gotta love the Buzzcocks, so I do think that that's a pretty good spot for them, and we'll be talking about Buzzcocks until the end of time. And just so you know who you're dealing with here, bands like Buzzcocks, The Damned, and The Clash aren't really my favorite kinds of music. I'm definitely more of a Minor Threat, Bad Brains kind of guy. Okay, so we've talked a lot about the very beginnings of punk rock in London. Now we're going to talk about the very beginnings of hardcore in Los Angeles, and that's this band called X. X were right there at the very beginning of hardcore. They were one of the bands where people were like, this isn't just regular punk rock, we got to come up with a new term for this, and these were one of the bands that I would say helped inspire the term hardcore. Do I think they belong here on the iceberg? Maybe not so much. I'd put them a little bit below the surface here. But great band. If you haven't checked them out, highly recommend it. So far on this list, we've come across a couple of favorite bands of mine, like Minor Threat, Bad Brains, Blink-182 way back in the day. Now we're going to talk about another one, and that's Minutemen. I don't really agree with the placement here on this list, because when I go out there into the wild and I start talking about the Minutemen, people of a certain age have no idea who these guys are. So I think that their influence has kind of fallen off. But as soon as you show anybody Minutemen songs, especially if you make them listen to a whole record, the amount of creativity and fun that these guys displayed on their records is enough to turn anybody into a fan. But it's a really tragic tale, one of automobile accidents, deaths, and breakups, that kind of thing. And just before they got rolling, tragedy struck. So it really sucks that that happened to Minutemen, but if you haven't checked them out yet, please go ahead and do that. Great band. They're called the Minutemen for a reason, because their songs are, a minute and change, and they pack so many creative ideas into those little minute songs. It's unbelievable. Next band, Social Distortion. I've never been a fan of Social Distortion, and that's basically just because of the way this guy looks. I don't know, maybe some people think that this is the coolest look that a guy can look like, but to me, I'm staying away. I'm staying clear from the greaser of tomorrow, Not a huge fan. Their songs are kind of catchy, but they're just kind of sort of rock and roll songs. I don't know. I've never really been a huge fan. But they're the only band here technically on the iceberg. Next band, another really early band called Adolescence. And it's one of those band names that sounds so ubiquitous that you're like, do I know that band? Of course you do. Look at this logo. You've seen this before. They're another one of those early 80s California bands that helped inspire the term hardcore. So it turns out there's a lot more of these once favorite bands of mine when we look at Operation Ivy here. That one record that they have just is so replayable. You can go back to that thing. year after year after year, and those songs still hold up. And there's a reason for that, is because they're really well-written and well-performed songs. If you're not familiar with Operation Ivy, they were formed in 1987 by Tim Armstrong of Rancid and Matt Freeman of the same band, that guy that can really play that bass, alongside Jesse Michaels. And once they got really popular and people really started banging Operation Ivy, Jesse Michaels was like, yo, this isn't why I started Operation Ivy. I don't want to like sign to a major record label. This is just like supposed to be for us playing at Gilman. So they kind of broke up after they put out that one record, and a bunch of people started spinning it. And it's so funny that we're gonna go over here after Operation Ivy. We're not gonna talk about Rancid. Rancid is nowhere on this list, but NoFX is, and NoFX is like the one band that is just as adjacent to Rancid as you can get. What more is there to say about NoFX? They're like Fat Mike's project, they're still going to this day. Whatever, everybody knows NoFX. They probably should be a lot higher on this list, because like I said, everybody knows NoFX. All right, so that concludes the top portion, the above water portion of this iceberg list. So now it's time to put on our scuba gear and go below that surface. Now the first band we're going to encounter below the surface here is the Circle Jerks. Now I've already mentioned part of the Circle Jerks here before, Keith Morris, who was the first singer in Black Flag. He broke apart of Black Flag to start the Circle Jerks, which is a way less good band. But they are great. I gotta give them some credit. You know, they are a really good band. But just as iconic as their music is, this little slam dancing guy is just as iconic. And do I agree with their placement here just below the surface? Yeah, sure, why not? X-Ray Specs. We're going to go across the pond there to England again, governor. And yeah, they belong there in 1977, a little bit proto-punk, right there at the very precipice of punk rock. Yeah, X-Ray Specs, great band. Over here beside X-Ray Specs, we're gonna see Fear, and I believe that Fear kind of belong here on this iceberg list. They were right there at the beginning of punk rock and right there at the beginning of hardcore in California. So they were like the right band at the right place in a couple different times, a couple years apart from one another. And I've covered this band on the channel before. They're that band that played Saturday Night Live. They had a whole like mosh pit on Saturday Night Live. Yeah, that's right, the Saturday Night Live on NBC. They had people slam dancing, and not only people, Ian Mackay was one of the slam dancers slam dancing to Fear, the hardcore punk rock band on Saturday Night Live. So I'm not sure how much more iconic you can get. And for all of that, I might want to bump them up here above the surface, but in today's day and age, I don't think that their name carries as much cred as these other names up here. So right below the surface is good enough for me. Next band, No Means No. Kind of this Canadian punk rock band that I'm not really familiar with, so I'm not going to really talk too much about them. All right, now let's go one more layer below that. Agent Orange. They're an American punk rock band formed in 1979, and I would say that they're one of the first Ramones core bands that tried to do that whole surf punk thing in the same style of the Ramones, but still a great band and stand on their own merit. Do they belong right here? No, I'd put them a little bit lower if I'm being honest with you. Next band, Suicidal Tendencies. Wonderful band, wonderfully iconic band, and I would confidently put Suicidal Tendencies above the surface here. Maybe I'd replace them here with X. But yeah, Suicidal Tendencies. What more do I need to say? They're the crossover thrash band. Okay, and beside them is another band that I would put way higher on this list. The Descendants below the surface? Are you kidding me? We're talking about the Descendants here. There wouldn't be pop punk without the Descendants. This is the Descendants. You know, the Milo Goes to College Descendants. You know them? These guys with this logo? Everybody knows the Descendants. What are you talking about? But yeah, the Dictators do belong below the surface. Not a lot of people know about them. You know, and I'm not really super familiar with them. I've heard of them, obviously. But they're just one of those bands that are a little bit before the time that I started really caring about music. 1973, psh, I don't care about that. I'm a 1977 to 2022 kind of person. All right, we're gonna get a little bit political when we go a little bit below the Dictators and talk about Reagan Youth. And that's kind of a funny name because, you know, it's kind of a play on Hitler Youth, but instead Reagan Youth. And yeah, they were saying a lot of political messaging in their music. And if that's your kind of thing, well, these guys will be for you. And they were formed in like 1980 in, of course, America, and they were definitely anarchist as hell. Next band, TSOL. Yeah, I think that's a good spot for them down here. Not quite the abyss, but we're getting down there. And these guys kind of bounced around genre to genre. You know, they were doing horror punk, death rock, all sorts of like hair metal stuff at one point. But, you know, to each their own. They're not really my thing, but they did a lot for the scene back in the day. Now, this next band, I'm surprised they're so low, but they're actually surprisingly still going to this day, and that's The Exploited. Sex and violence, sex and violence, sex and violence. Those guys. Yeah, so, you know, spike your mohawks, dye it red. This is him right here. Yeah, he's still blabbing on today. Not exactly my thing. A little bit too meat and potatoes for me. But they are kind of like the hard-edged Sex Pistols. If you like that Sex Pistols flavored punk rock, but you want a little bit more edge to it, then yeah, maybe you go to The Exploited. Alright, the Dead Boys, kind of around before punk rock turned into punk rock, and not really a band that I listen to a lot of, but I understand like a lot of people were like inspired by their frontman and like their kind of like exuberant way of presenting themselves on stage. But I never really got super into them. Another band that I didn't get super into, and that's clearly because I just don't like them, and that's DOA. And it's not that I don't like them politically or I don't like them personally, none of that. I just think their music sucks. And I understand their like historic significance and that like they had the couch that Henry Rollins slept on during those tours through Canada or whatever. But I just don't really care too much about DOA. But it is impressive that they're still fucking going today. British Columbia represent. Now this next band here, Gangrene. I think more people know the name Gangrene than they know any songs by Gangrene. Because I know that's definitely the case for me. Here's a band that I'm surprised is so far down on this iceberg. I put them way up there above the surface. Maybe here where the jam is like located. And that's Refused. They did a lot for like the hardcore scene in like the late 90s, but the hardcore scene didn't want anything to do with them, so they were like, you know what, we're gonna kind of reinvent punk rock and then disband because we all hate each other. And that legend, that story of that record is gonna live on forever and ever and ever and ever and ever. So no matter what you think of this band, how pretentious they are, you know, all like the kind of wanky nonsense they do in their music, I understand that their political messaging is a little bit fucking preachy and ham-fisted. All of those critiques I understand, but because of that one record, The Shape of Punk to Come, and the story that goes along with it, they're going to live on forever and ever and ever and ever and ever. Here's another band that I'm surprised is so far down in the depths of the ocean over here, and that's Darby Crash's band, The Germs. Germs! They're that band that Darby Crash was in. Now, Darby Crash was one of these vocalists that was just like fucked up beyond fucked up. He would like self-mutilate. You know, I guess that wasn't anything new at the time, but he would just do it to like a crazy degree and just bleed all over the place. He had like this weird puffy hairstyle with the big rat tail in the back. He was just a completely disheveled human being. He was so wasted on every drug imaginable when he'd be performing, and he would just like forget to sing into the microphone. That was just the kind of energy that you got with the Germs. But not only that, you got Pat Smear. Now you might recognize that name because he played in Nirvana and later the Foo Fighters. And of course, Lorna Doom and Don Bowles. They only put out that one record, GI, but it is super iconic. And that fucking blue circle, goddamn. So simple, so powerful. It's just a shame that it's a tragic story because Darby Crash ends up like unaliving himself, and then the band breaks up, and then they get back together years later and do this movie, and then everybody else in the punk world is like, what are you doing making this like corporate ass movie about a guy who died for the cause way back in the day? So that's a whole thing. I might do a whole video on that in the future. So yeah, I put them higher up on this list, for sure, for sure. The next band on this list is Subhumans. Now there are two Subhumans. There's the Canadian one, which isn't the one that's iconic. And then there is the British one that is endlessly iconic. They might be the English punk band that I would recommend that you listen to if you like that kind of like meat and potatoes, punk rock, flavored punk rock. Because Subhumans they just do it better than anyone. MDC is going to be our next band here, and I gotta tell you the truth, I'm not super familiar with them, so I would say that this is a good placement for that band. But let's see what Google tells me they are. They're a punk rock band, no kidding. formed in 1979 in Austin, Texas. They're a Texas hardcore band? Well, alright, great. Oh, and also San Francisco and Portland. Alright, that's a good mixture of places, I guess, to be from. Okay, everything that I just said about Subhumans, I can say times 10 about GBH. They're one of those British punk rock bands that do British punk rock to the, like, most extreme. They are the British punk rock band. Look at these fucking guys. You got the Liberty spikes, you got the puffed hair, you got the mohawk, the studs, the belts, the vests, the pins, the patches, Motorhead. God damn, they got everything going for them. If anybody were to dress like this today, it would be almost too cartoonish. It would look like a parody of punk rock. That's how punk rock this stuff is. But just like I was saying earlier, I think more people are familiar with the letters GBH than they are with the tunes that GBH put out. I can definitely say with confidence that I have never heard of Big Black. So I'm going to go out of my way and check out Big Black. But apparently they were formed in 81, and they look like they kind of have this nerd punk aesthetic, and I think that that's pretty cool. Next band I don't know much about. Actually, I do know much about these guys. This is DI. They're a great band. And just like Adolescence, they were right there in California when like the term hardcore was coming about, and that was like the kickstart of the second wave of like punk rock being super energized in the scene, you know? Okay, now we are officially below the iceberg. We are in the abyss, the depths. The pressure of the ocean is getting so much when we look at the Angry Samoans, and that sounds like it should be a tag team in the Worldwide Wrestling Federation in 1981, but they were, in fact, an American punk rock band in 1978. Now everybody's heard of the Angry Samoans, but I gotta be honest, I couldn't name one single track of theirs, except for this one, because it's right here in front of me. Time Has Come Today. I have not heard of Battalion of Saints or Ill Repute, but it surprises the ever-loving snot out of me that Bold is like the bottomest band over here. They're from Westchester. Westchester is the best Chester, and they kind of, you know, they're one of those late 80s bands that defined that hardcore sound. One of the only kind of bands that I currently listen to on this list, and I'm super, super surprised that they're at the very, very bottom. But no, we keep going down. We got Atlantis down here, apparently. And then it says the millions of fucking small town local bands. And that's true. There wouldn't be a punk rock, there wouldn't be a scene if it weren't for the millions and millions of hardworking local punk rock bands. Okay, so that was the punk rock iceberg, completely explained in full detail. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, please like, subscribe, and share the video. Until my next upload, watch another upload.